happens to a country when the roads that feed its military simply stop existing overnight? In just a few hours, one of Iran's most important ports lost its connection to the rest of the nation, and almost nobody outside the region noticed until the smoke was already visible from space. Before we go any further, if you want to actually understand where this war is headed instead of just reacting to headlines, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. This story is moving fast, and I don't want you finding out 3 days late. Let's set the scene properly, because what happened here deserves more than a quick headline. In the early hours of a Friday in mid-July 2026, American forces expanded their air campaign against Iran in a way that hadn't happened before in this conflict. Multiple sources tracking the war closely reported that U.S. aircraft struck at least 6 major bridges overnight in Iran's southern Hormozgan Province, focused heavily around the coastal city of Bandar Abbas, right at the edge of the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian state television confirmed that at least 7 people died in that wave of strikes. Beyond the bridges themselves, the operation also hit a rail junction along a key line at an airport farther inland. A port control tower reportedly came down in the same night. This wasn't scattered, chaotic bombing. It was precise. It was deliberate, and it was aimed at something far more strategic than it first appears. The bridges that were destroyed carried traffic directly out of Bandar Abbas, a city that also happens to host the headquarters of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy. From there, those same roads stretched north toward Shiraz, and eventually toward Tehran itself. Once you understand that layout, the target choice stops looking random and starts looking surgical. Bandar Abbas isn't just one port among many for Iran. It's arguably the single most important logistics hub tied to the Strait of Hormuz. Weapons move through it. Fuel moves through it. Supplies for the Revolutionary Guard move through it. So when the roads and rail lines connecting that port to the rest of the country get destroyed in a single night, you're not simply damaging infrastructure, you're cutting a lifeline. Think about it in the simplest terms possible. It doesn't matter how many missiles a country has stored in a warehouse if there's no way to physically move them from that warehouse to a launch site. A weapon sitting in storage might as well not exist. That's exactly why some analysts have started calling this a logistics siege. No soldiers stepped onto Iranian soil, no tanks rolled across the border. Instead, the strategy has become something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. A slow, methodical strangling of the supply chain from the air. The effects on the ground were immediate. Local authorities in Hormozgan confirmed that roads leading into Bandar Abbas were completely blocked in the aftermath. Traffic eventually began moving again in limited amounts, but officials still urged residents to avoid unnecessary travel. And here's a detail that might sound small, but actually carries enormous weight. Iran's own energy ministry asked people across the southern provinces to reduce their electricity usage. The official explanation was extreme heat. But for the first time in this entire conflict, Iranian officials also quietly admitted that parts of the national power grid had already been damaged by the strikes. That admission matters more than it might seem at first glance. Tehran was publicly acknowledging, even indirectly, that the campaign against it was already reaching the electrical system. And this was happening before any of the larger strikes on power stations that had been repeatedly threatened. When a government starts admitting damage instead of denying it, that usually means the damage is bigger than what's actually being said out loud. None of this happened in isolation either. The bridge strikes followed directly after another major escalation just one night earlier. On the Tuesday before, the United States reinstated a full naval blockade around Iran's ports. Commercial shipping companies were warned in plain terms to stay away from Iranian oil terminals. Almost every captain complied immediately. One did not. According to U.S. Central Command, a tanker flying a foreign flag, empty at the time, ignored repeated warnings and kept moving toward Karg Island, Iran's main oil export terminal. A U.S. aircraft responded by firing missiles directly into the ship's smokestack, disabling it without rupturing its fuel tanks and without causing an oil spill. The tanker turned sharply away from the island shortly afterward. Nobody on board was hurt. But the message sent to every other tanker operator watching from a distance was impossible to misunderstand. Try to break the blockade, and you will be stopped, one way or another. Then, just one night after that tanker was disabled, the bridge strikes began. 2 separate operations within roughly 24 hours, one at sea, one on land, both pointed at the exact same goal, cutting Iran off from the resources it needs to keep fighting. Iran did not stay quiet. In response, Iranian forces launched missiles toward several neighboring countries hosting American troops, including Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Qatar. Qatar, notably, has spent months trying to help mediate an end to this exact conflict. And for the first time since the war began, one of those retaliatory strikes crossed into territory that hadn't been touched before. A missile damaged a power and desalination facility inside Kuwait, a claim confirmed by multiple independent sources. Take a moment to really sit with that detail. A desalination plant isn't a military base. It isn't a weapons depot. It's civilian infrastructure that provides drinking water to an entire country. And Kuwait, sitting in a desert region, depends on facilities exactly like this one to survive. Striking something like that isn't just another rung on the escalation ladder. It's the kind of move that starts pulling in ordinary people who have absolutely nothing to do with the fighting itself. So, where does all of this leave things right now? A naval blockade fully back in force, the bridge network tying Iran's most important port to the rest of the country in ruins, a desalination plant damaged inside a country aligned with the United States, and Iran's own energy officials publicly admitting, for the first time, that the national power grid has already taken damage. Before we go further, I want to know something from you. If you had to guess right now, do you think this pressure campaign pushes Iran toward the negotiating table, or does it just harden their position? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what we dig into in future videos. Now let's talk about just how much damage this combined strategy, a naval blockade at sea paired with bridge strikes on land, has actually done to Iran's ability to keep fighting. Because the numbers coming out this week are getting difficult to brush aside. Multiple monitoring groups tracking missile activity say Iran's daily launch rate has dropped sharply compared to just a few weeks earlier, falling to what some estimates describe as only around a dozen launches per day. That's a steep decline from the pace Iran was maintaining at earlier points in the conflict. Analysts studying this pattern believe it's a direct consequence of the blockade and the bridge campaign working together. If the roads linking missile production and storage sites to the coast are destroyed, and the ports themselves are sealed off by an active naval and air presence, then new weapons simply cannot reach the places they need to be fired from. This is a strategy built on patience rather than a single decisive blow. It wears down an opponent's capability one transport link at a time, without a single American soldier ever setting foot on Iranian territory. Then there's a claim that, if it holds up, says a great deal about how effective American missile defense has become in this theater. Speaking to reporters on the sidelines of a NATO summit in Turkey, President Trump stated that Iran had fired over 100 missiles at a U.S. aircraft carrier deployed in the region, all within roughly 1 hour, and that every single one had been intercepted. None of them hit the ship, he said, and he made a point of noting what the consequences would have been if even one had gotten through. It's important to be precise here. This account came directly from the president, and at the time it hadn't been independently verified or formally confirmed through official Pentagon channels. But if the general outline turns out to be accurate, it would rank among the most significant real-world demonstrations of layered missile defense capability seen in this entire war. And it fits a broader pattern. The carrier strike group involved has been operating in the region since the start of the year, supported by destroyers equipped with their own missile defense systems, with a second carrier group also active nearby. Whether the exact number was slightly higher or lower, the core claim that American naval defenses in this region are currently intercepting nearly everything Iran throws at them is the kind of fact that shapes how confident Washington feels as it continues to escalate. That confidence shows up in troop numbers too. Coverage of the regional military buildup suggests the United States now has more than 50,000 personnel stationed across the Middle East, up from a typical baseline of around 40,000 spread across bases in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait. Recent deployments, including an amphibious assault ship carrying additional Marines and fighter jets, have pushed this buildup into territory many are now calling the largest American military presence in the region since the Iraq War. Officials describe these forces as being on high alert, ready to respond if the situation demands it. Is that purely a defensive posture meant to protect existing assets, or is it groundwork for something bigger? No official has spelled that out clearly, but the sheer scale of it is exactly what's keeping regional analysts on edge. If this level of detail is exactly what you come here for, do me a quick favor and smash that like button before you keep watching. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are only getting the shallow version of this story elsewhere. Meanwhile, along the coast, one particular site keeps reappearing in strike reports throughout this entire campaign, the control tower at Chabahar Port. This most recent strike marked the third time American forces have targeted that exact structure, and this time, reports indicate it was fully destroyed. Alongside it, smaller access roads connecting nearby towns to the same coastal supply route were also hit. None of this is being carried out with a single type of weapon or platform. It's a coordinated mix of fighter jets, drones, and naval vessels, all operating over the same stretch of coastline and the roads feeding into it. That combination, manned aircraft, unmanned surveillance systems, and warships all watching the same patches of water and land at once, matters a great deal, because it's a huge part of why Iran's remaining options keep shrinking. Long-endurance surveillance drones can orbit above a single vessel for hours before any decision to strike is even made, covering far more territory than any single aircraft or ship ever could alone. Rather than sinking ships outright, the preferred tactic increasingly seems to be disabling without destroying, exactly what happened to the tanker near Karg Island. That distinction carries real diplomatic weight. A disabled ship sends a clear, forceful warning without automatically triggering an international incident. A sunken one, especially involving a vessel flagged to a third country, risks doing exactly that. Now put all of these pieces together, a missile launch rate reduced to a fraction of what it was, a naval blockade being actively enforced with real consequences for anyone who tries to test it, bridges and rail lines linking Iran's most critical port left in ruins, a control tower finally destroyed after 2 earlier attempts failed, and a president publicly describing carrier-scale missile barrages being intercepted at what sounds close to a 100% success rate. It's easy to see why so many observers are now calling this a genuine turning point rather than just another cycle of headlines. While all of this was unfolding in the Gulf, something unexpected was happening in a completely different war zone, and the connection between the two is closer than it might first appear. In Ukraine, large protests broke out in Kyiv after President Zelensky removed his defense minister from office. That official, still in his mid-30s, had only held the position for about 6 months, but during that short stretch, he had become widely credited with dramatically accelerating Ukraine's drone warfare program, the very same program responsible for deep strikes inside Russian territory and disruptions to Moscow's energy infrastructure. Hundreds of demonstrators gathered near a major theater in central Kyiv, with similar protests spreading to several other cities across the country. The removed official didn't step aside quietly either. He publicly criticized Ukraine's top general, accusing military leadership of making decisions based on personal loyalty rather than solid data, and openly questioning whether Ukraine could realistically win the war under the current command structure. It marked the most visible public rift inside Ukraine's defense establishment since the war with Russia began, and it happened during the exact same week that both the Ukrainian and Iranian conflicts were dominating global headlines. Here's why that connection actually matters to this story. Ukraine hasn't been entirely disconnected from the confrontation with Iran. Earlier this year, during a period when direct American aid to Ukraine was temporarily paused, U.S. officials reportedly reached out to Kyiv for help countering Iranian-designed drones, the same type of drones Iran has been supplying to Russia for use against Ukrainian cities. Ukraine agreed to send military specialists into the Gulf region to help support safe shipping routes, with the newly removed defense minister himself describing it at the time as Ukrainian experts contributing real, practical support to the effort. In other words, the same official just pushed out of his position amid domestic protests had, until very recently, been one of the people helping coordinate technical support against the very systems Iran continues to rely on. Losing an experienced strategist in the middle of an active war, regardless of the internal political reasons behind it, is exactly the kind of disruption that tends to ripple outward into places nobody initially expects. And that's really the point many analysts keep making. Modern conflicts rarely stay fully contained anymore. They lean on each other, echo each other, and quietly shape each other in ways that don't always make it into the headlines. Now let's return to the central question hanging over everything happening in the Gulf right now. What is Iran actually trying to achieve here? Publicly, Tehran frames this entire conflict as purely defensive, protecting its sovereignty and resisting outside pressure. But analysts who have been mapping the pattern of events over the past several weeks increasingly believe the real objective runs much deeper than that. The goal, many argue, isn't short-term wartime advantage. It's long-term, durable leverage over the Strait of Hormuz itself, leverage that doesn't simply disappear the moment a ceasefire gets signed. The numbers explain exactly why that prize is worth so much. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply passes through that narrow stretch of water every single day. A country able to maintain quiet, lasting influence over that passage, without ever fully closing it off, would gain enormous leverage over the global economy, simply through the constant possibility that it could disrupt the flow whenever it chose to. Missiles kept on standby, patrol boats positioned to harass commercial vessels, a hidden fleet of unmarked tankers built to move oil outside the reach of international sanctions and regulation. Some analysts have started calling this a toll booth strategy. Iran doesn't need to fully close the strait to gain real power from it. It only needs the rest of the world to believe it could, at any moment, if pushed far enough. Seen through that lens, an earlier incident from a few weeks back suddenly looks very different in hindsight. When Iranian forces attacked commercial vessels, despite an active ceasefire earlier this year, many early commentators dismissed it as a blunder, an isolated and avoidable mistake. Looking back now, with everything that's followed, more analysts interpret it as something far more deliberate. A calculated test to see whether the United States would actually respond with force or quietly look the other way in order to protect a fragile peace agreement. Judging by everything that has happened since, the naval blockade, more than a week of continuous strikes, destroyed command sites, and now the bridges connecting Iran's most important port turned to rubble, the answer to that test has become unmistakably clear. The United States did not look away. For Tehran, that likely wasn't the outcome it had gambled on. A strategy built around quietly probing red lines without triggering full-scale war now appears, at least for the moment, to have backfired significantly. Missile output has dropped sharply, key supply routes into its most important port have been severed. Its Shadow Fleet operations are under direct active threat, exactly as we saw with that disabled tanker near Karg Island. By nearly every visible measure, Iran now finds itself in a considerably weaker position than it held just a few weeks earlier. And yet, analysts caution against assuming this means the conflict is anywhere close to winding down. Iran's central strategic ambition, lasting leverage over the world's most critical oil choke point, hasn't disappeared simply because some of its immediate tools have been damaged. Even from a weakened position, Tehran may continue searching for new pressure points, whether through regional proxy groups, whatever remains of its gray market tanker network, or renewed attempts to quietly test the boundaries of any future ceasefire, the same way it tested the last one. On the American side, the current posture looks firm. With more than 50,000 troops in the region, 2 carrier strike groups actively deployed, and officials treating an open Strait of Hormuz as completely non-negotiable, this increasingly resembles a long-term commitment rather than a short-term reaction. If you've made it this far, you already care more about the real story than most people watching the news tonight. So do one more thing before we close this out. Share this video with one person who only reads the headlines and never the details behind them. So let's bring everything together, because after walking through all of it, the bridges destroyed around Bandar Abbas, the tanker disabled near Karg Island, a desalination plant struck inside Kuwait, and a defense shakeup in Kyiv that's more connected to this story than it first appears, one clear question remains. What does the destruction of Iran's bridges in a single night actually tell us about where this war is heading? First, it tells us the conflict has clearly moved beyond simply destroying weapons and defensive systems. For weeks, this campaign followed a fairly predictable pattern. Coastal radar sites, patrol boats, command facilities, missile depots. Bridges belong to an entirely different category of target. They aren't weapons. They aren't military bases. They're the physical backbone that allows an entire country to function day to day, moving fuel, moving food, moving military equipment, but also simply getting ordinary workers to their jobs and goods to local markets. Once infrastructure like that becomes a routine, repeated target, the entire character of the war shifts, and it becomes far harder to walk back. You can rebuild a measure of trust after a wave of missile strikes ends. It's far harder to rebuild that same trust after a country's basic transportation network has been methodically dismantled, piece by piece. That's really the thread connecting everything we've covered here. Command centers hit to disrupt coordination. A naval blockade reimposed to choke off what moves by sea. Bridges destroyed to sever what moves by land. A desalination plant in an allied nation damaged in retaliation. Individually, each of these might look like a standalone news story. Taken together, they form one unmistakable pattern. A war that has expanded from targeting an enemy's weapons to targeting the very systems that keep an entire nation, and increasingly its neighbors, running. So where does this realistically lead from here? Analysts who study conflicts like this one generally point to a few possible paths, and none of them are guaranteed outcomes. The first is a slow, grinding path toward de-escalation under sustained pressure. The blockade holding firm, missile launches continuing to fall, the bridges staying gone long enough to eventually force Iran back to negotiations, but from a far weaker starting position than it held even a month earlier. Given that Iran's own energy ministry has already admitted grid damage for the first time, and that provincial officials have confirmed serious disruption around Bandar Abbas, there's at least some real indication that this pressure is landing exactly where it was intended to. The second path is a drawn-out standoff, with neither side fully backing down, both settling into a long, tense rhythm of limited strikes and limited retaliation without any clear resolution in sight. Given how many consecutive nights of strikes we've already seen, and the fact that Iran's foreign ministry continues to insist there are no active negotiations underway, even as its own energy officials quietly admit real damage, this stalemate scenario currently looks just as plausible as any diplomatic breakthrough. The third path, and the one that genuinely deserves attention, is further escalation. Infrastructure strikes on both sides expanding further, pulling in additional countries, and causing greater harm to civilians who have no real stake in the fighting. That's the exact trajectory we're already seeing hints of with the strike on Kuwait's desalination facility. Once critical civilian infrastructure becomes an intentional, repeated target rather than a rare accident, the danger isn't only that the war continues. It's that finding a genuine exit becomes harder for both sides, as domestic pressure at home keeps demanding further retaliation. And what's clear, no matter which of these paths ends up unfolding, is that this conflict has fundamentally changed over the past week. It's no longer simply a story about missiles, radar systems, and military bases. It's now a struggle over supply chains, energy networks, and long-term control of one of the most strategically important waterways on the entire planet. A struggle where roughly a fifth of the world's daily oil supply hangs in the balance for as long as this continues. And whichever side ends up holding meaningful leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, once this finally settles, may carry outsized influence over the global economy for years, long after every last bridge has been rebuilt. We're going to keep following this story closely, night after night. Because based on the pace of the last week, command centers hit one night, a blockade reinforced the next, bridges destroyed the night after that, there's very little reason to believe things are about to slow down anytime soon. If you want to stay with us through whatever comes next, this is exactly the kind of channel built for that. Subscribe, share this with someone who's only catching the surface level version of this story, and let's keep tracking exactly where this war goes from here, together. Because wars like this one are almost never decided in a single dramatic night. They're decided in the slow, steady accumulation of nights, just like this one, each of them quietly reshaping what the world after this war is actually going to look like.